Imagine being accused of adultery in a world where a whisper could destroy your life. In the Middle Ages, a cheating wife didn't just risk her marriage, she risked her body, her freedom, and sometimes her soul. Chapter 1: The Accusation. How cheating was proven in a world without privacy. Imagine living in a world where your neighbors knew what time you woke up, what you cooked, and who visited your home. That was the Middle Ages, where privacy didn't exist, and an accusation could spread faster than a fire on a thatched roof. For a woman, especially a married one, the most dangerous rumor of all was this: she's been unfaithful. It didn't take evidence. It didn't take witnesses. Often, all it took was suspicion, or someone with a grudge. A world built on gossip. In a small medieval village, nearly everyone lived within a few dozen meters of each other. Walls were thin, doors didn't lock, windows were open holes with shutters. If a stranger came to a married woman's home when her husband was away, everyone noticed. Gossip wasn't harmless, it was currency, and women often became its target. And once gossip started, it rarely stopped. Church versus reputation, a dangerous combination in the medieval mindset. Adultery wasn't just a moral sin, it was a threat to property, lineage, and male honor. A husband needed to be certain that the children he raised were truly his. The church preached that infidelity damned souls. Meanwhile, the community believed it brought bad luck and divine punishment. So if a woman was accused, nearly every system around her turned against her. The church demanded confession. The community demanded answers. The husband demanded obedience or retribution. The law usually sided with the husband. Women had almost no authority to defend themselves, even. Their silence could be twisted into guilt. The evidence that wasn't evidence today. We expect proof. In the Middle Ages, proof could be almost anything. A few examples: being alone with a man even if nothing happened, this alone could be considered enough for suspicion. Acting too cheerful after a man visited, believe it or not, emotional expression was often judged as guilt. Having a child who didn't resemble the husband, medieval people believed resemblance was divine proof of parentage. Being disliked by the community, yes, sometimes a woman's reputation was decided by popularity, not truth. And here's something even darker. Sometimes husbands accused wives intentionally as a threat, way to control them, or even to get rid of them entirely. The church inquiry: confess or be judged. Once gossip reached a priest, matters became dangerous. A priest could summon the woman and question her with a chilling method: God will reveal your guilt if you lie. This often placed enormous psychological pressure on innocent women. Confessing, whether true or not, was sometimes seen as the only way to prevent harsher punishment. For many women, a forced confession became the beginning of their downfall. The community tribunal. In some towns, accusations were handled through informal group hearings. Imagine the pressure of standing before the village elders, men who believed they were guardians of morality while neighbors whispered behind you. The result could be shaming, forced oaths, temporary exile, or being passed to the legal courts. And once a case reached the legal system, things got even worse. Cliffhanger ending for Chapter 1, but the accusation was only the beginning. Because proving innocence in the Middle Ages wasn't like going to court today. It meant facing boiling water, red-hot iron, or even drowning tests. So what happened next? What terrifying ordeals did women have to endure just to prove they didn't cheat? That's where Chapter 2 begins. Chapter 2: Trials, Ordeals, and Terrifying Tests of Truth. If being accused of adultery was terrifying, being forced to prove your innocence was even worse. Medieval justice wasn't built on logic or evidence, it relied on fear, superstition, and a chilling belief that God would protect the innocent. And so, accused women were handed over to a system that mixed religion, pain, and public humiliation into something far more frightening than any modern courtroom. The logic of medieval justice today: a fair trial needs proof, witnesses, and objective judgment. In the Middle Ages, trials often relied on a completely different rule: if she is innocent, God will save her. This wasn't a metaphor. The courts meant it literally. So instead of finding evidence, authorities forced women to endure physical trials, ordeals designed to let God show the truth. If a woman survived or recovered quickly, she was innocent. If not, well, God had spoken, but these ordeals weren't just painful. They were intentionally impossible to pass. Trial by water, the deadly paradox. One of the most infamous tests for accused women was the ordeal by water. The logic went like this: water is pure. A sinful person is rejected by water. Her wrists are bound. Priests chant nearby. The judge nods. She is lowered into the water. If she floats, she's guilty and will face punishment. If she sinks, her husband and neighbors must pull her up before she drowns. Some didn't get pulled up in time. And even if she survived, the humiliation was permanent. The memory of the crowd's eyes watching her struggle in cold water stayed with her forever. Ordeal by hot iron pain as proof. Another terrifying test was the hot iron ordeal. The accused woman had to carry a burning hot iron bar for a few steps or press her hand onto it. Her hand was then wrapped and sealed. After 3 days, the priest unwrapped it to see what God decided: if the burn healed cleanly, innocent; if it became infected or blistered, guilty. This test was cruel beyond imagination. Women burned themselves just to satisfy a system that offered no compassion, and infections, especially in the Middle Ages, were extremely common, meaning this ordeal was almost designed to declare guilt. Imagine the courtroom. The iron glows red. Villagers watch in silence. The woman trembles, knowing that her marriage, her reputation, and possibly her life depend on how her skin reacts to fire. Some fainted before touching it. Others gritted their teeth and prayed. Most were declared guilty. For many accused women, this was impossible. Who would swear on God's name for a woman they barely knew? God has spoken. She is guilty. Sometimes the silence of a crowd hurt more than any iron. Confession through terror. Many women confessed simply to avoid the ordeal entirely. But for women, confession was often the end of their freedom. Public penance, humiliation as truth. Some women didn't face painful ordeals but instead endured deeply degrading punishments. Kneeling outside the church in winter wearing a sackcloth, or nothing but a shift, holding a candle and begging the community for forgiveness. In many villages, public shame was the real punishment. Even more than physical harm. Cliffhanger ending for Chapter 2. But even if a woman survived the ordeal or public shame, one question remained. What happened when she returned home back to her husband, the man who now believed she had betrayed him? Some husbands forgave. Others unleashed punishments far harsher than the courts. Chapter 3 reveals the shocking powers medieval husbands had over their wives and the brutal punishments they could legally carry out. Chapter 3 Punishments inside marriage. What husbands could legally do if a woman survived the accusations, the trials, and the humiliation. She wasn't safe. In fact, her real punishment often began after she went home, because medieval law gave husbands astonishing control over their wives, and once a wife was suspected of cheating, that authority tightened like a noose. The husband's rights, more power than most people realize. Modern marriages might rely on communication or counseling, but medieval marriages relied on hierarchy. Husbands had legally recognized rights that would be shocking today. They could force them into public humiliation. Rituals demand lifelong obedience to make up for the betrayal. Some laws even allowed a husband to kill a wife caught in the act, with almost no repercussions. That is how deeply the fear of infidelity ran. But not every punishment involved violence. Some were psychological, and they were just as devastating. Humiliation as discipline. In many regions, a husband could legally use shame as a tool to correct a wife. That goal wasn't just punishment, it was permanent reputation damage. A husband might force her to kneel before neighbors and confess, mark her clothing with symbols of adultery. Imagine walking through our own village while people you've known since childhood laugh, whisper, or look away in judgment. That humiliation didn't fade. People remembered it for decades. For some husbands, this public spectacle was revenge. For others, it was a way of reclaiming control. The locked room, domestic imprisonment. Unlike courts, which used dungeons, husbands used lock and key control within their own homes. One chronicler writes of a husband who built wooden bars around his wife's bed to prevent her from wandering in the night. Another kept his wife tethered with a rope inside the home just long enough to reach the kitchen but not the door. There were no laws stopping this. No authorities checking on her well-being. No neighbors willing to interfere. To the medieval mind, this was simply a man-keeping order, punishment through labor. Some husbands punished their wives by forcing them into grueling workloads, washing clothes for the entire village, repairing tools, carrying heavy loads of water. These tasks weren't just tiring. They were backbreaking. A well-known court document from 13th century France describes a husband who made his accused wife grind grain through the night, refusing her sleep until she admitted her guilt. By morning, she could barely stand. Another man forced his wife to work barefoot in winter mud as neighbors watched. Medieval society believed that labor purified sin. Even when the sin wasn't real, the silent punishment, social death. Sometimes a husband didn't need violence at all. He could simply withdraw. No conversation, no companionship, no food at the table. In a world where a woman's safety depended entirely on her husband's status and connections, being socially abandoned could be more dangerous than any beating. A wife who lost her husband's support had almost no rights. She couldn't own property. She couldn't bring legal cases on her own. She couldn't leave the marriage without enormous consequences. Some women lived like ghosts in their own homes, present but invisible. When husbands went too far, there were rare cases where communities intervened, usually when a husband became so cruel that even medieval villagers felt uncomfortable. But even then, punishment was minimal. The law placed marital authority far above a wife's welfare. The truth is brutal. Most women suffered in silence, because speaking out meant challenging a system that never took their side. Cliffhanger ending for Chapter 3. But what happened when the community took charge instead of the husband? Chapter 4 reveals how entire towns turned adultery into public entertainment through shame parades, cages, dunking stools, and humiliations you won't believe were real. Chapter 4 Public shame and community justice. When villages became the judge, if a husband's punishment was harsh, the village's punishment was theatrical. Medieval communities believed they had a responsibility, a duty to maintain moral order, and when a woman was accused of cheating, the entire town felt entitled to judge her, shame her, and parade her as an example. In many ways, public punishment was the medieval equivalent of going viral for the worst possible reason. A society built on spectacle in a world with no movies, no festivals except on holy days, and no public entertainment, punishments became a morbid event. People gathered to watch justice unfold, almost like a theatrical performance. Children sat on fences. Merchants paused their work. The elderly came out from their cottages with walking sticks. Everyone knew something interesting was happening, and when the accused woman appeared, the crowd surged forward. One of the most iconic punishments for misbehaving women, including adulterers, was the dunking stool. This punishment was as humiliating as it was dangerous. Here's how it worked. The woman was tied to a wooden chair mounted on a long beam. Onlookers gathered near the river or pond. Each submersion sent the message: confess, repent, admit your sin. Some women fainted. Villagers saw it as moral cleansing, a justified humiliation, and in some cases, the dunking stool wasn't just symbolic. Women drowned during these punishments, their deaths dismissed as God's will. The shaving of the hair, the ultimate symbol of disgrace. A married woman's hair symbolized her dignity, status, and femininity. To shave it off was to strip her identity. This punishment was especially common in France, Germany, and parts of England. Imagine standing in the village square while a priest chants, "And your hair, your pride is chopped away," in front of everyone. Women sometimes begged to be beaten instead. Some tried to cover their faces. Others wept as locks fell around their feet. But the humiliation didn't end there. Some women were forced to wear hoods or bells to announce their presence. Others were given patched dresses or specific colors marking them as fallen. Every step they took became a reminder: you are not forgiven. The shame parade, a moving punishment. Another widespread punishment was the shame parade, a public walk through the village designed to humiliate the accused woman. She might be barefoot, wearing a shift or sackcloth, or holding a candle symbolizing repentance. Crowds followed her like a perverse procession. They shouted insults, joked about her, or tossed rotten vegetables. This wasn't merely about punishment, it was about reasserting community control. A woman who stepped outside the expected moral boundaries threatened the stability of the village. In some towns, women accused of adultery were locked into iron collars attached to poles in the public square. They couldn't move much, couldn't hide their faces, couldn't escape the stares. It's easy to think of medieval villagers as cruel for entertainment's sake, but there were deeper reasons behind this behavior. Villagers believed adultery brought divine wrath. Punishment deterred others from sin. Women weren't punished simply for betraying their husbands, they were punished for betraying the social order. To the medieval mind, a woman who broke the rules had to be corrected in front of everyone. Cliffhanger ending for Chapter 4. But even these public humiliations weren't the worst consequences. Some accusations of adultery spiraled into extreme punishments: mutilation, long-term imprisonment, or even execution. So the question becomes, when did medieval society decide a cheating woman deserved death? That's where Chapter 5 takes us, to the darkest edge of medieval justice. Chapter 5: Extreme Cases. Torture, imprisonment, and execution. Public shame was horrifying, but it wasn't the end of the story. In the darkest corners of medieval justice, under certain laws, regions, and rulers, women accused of adultery faced punishments that went far beyond humiliation. These were not the everyday cases. They were the extreme, rare, but very real outcomes of a world obsessed with purity, lineage, and reputation. In these moments, the medieval world revealed just how frightening its sense of morality could become. When adultery became a crime worth killing for most medieval women, accusations led to social ruin or punishment at home. But in some regions, adultery was not just a moral sin, it was a legal crime, punishable by mutilation, lifelong imprisonment, or even execution. But why such severity? Because medieval society believed adultery wasn't only a private betrayal. It was a threat to property, inheritance, a stain on family honor, a sin that could anger God, and a potential disruption to political alliances, especially among nobles and noble families. A single rumor of infidelity could destabilize an entire dynasty. Imagine a king raising a child who wasn't his, an unthinkable scandal. And in peasant communities, men believed they were owed certainty about lineage. The result: extreme punishments were justified as protecting society. Torture, extracting the truth in medieval courts, especially in parts of Germany, France, and Italy. Torture was used not as punishment but as a method of interrogation. For accused women, this meant being tied and stretched, suspended in stress positions. Torture was not used in every adultery case, but it was permitted when the husband was a noble. Property disputes were involved. Imagine being questioned by men who already believed you were guilty, with instruments nearby meant to make you confess the truth. While many punishments were public, imprisonment was quiet, and often worse. Medieval prisons were not like modern ones. They were cold, filthy, airless spaces, sometimes barely larger than a closet. Prisoners depended entirely on family or the church for food. If no one helped them, they starved. A woman accused of adultery could be imprisoned while awaiting trial. As punishment after a confession, some noble women were kept in luxurious confinement, locked in towers, guarded by servants. But for most, imprisonment meant darkness, rats, and isolation. A 14th century record from Burgundy describes a woman kept in a cellar until her husband chose to forgive her. Mutilation, punishment that marked for life. In certain areas of medieval Europe, especially among strict Germanic legal traditions, some women faced mutilation as a legal sentence. These punishments were designed not to kill, but to mark. Everyone who saw the scar, brand, or injury immediately knew. Execution, final. Most extreme penalty conditions that could lead to execution. High-ranking noble families protecting dynastic purity. Accusations involving political plots. Beheading for noble human whose infidelity endangered political alliances. Strangulation or hanging under local customary law. These cases were dramatic, sensational, and deeply public. One famous 14th century chronicle describes a noblewoman executed after bearing a child her husband believed wasn't his. Whether she was guilty or not was irrelevant. The political risk outweighed her life. In many communities, The husband didn't even need proof. His word carried more weight than hers ever could. The reality behind the extremes. It's important to understand that these punishments, while real, were not the everyday fate of most accused women. They were the outer edge of medieval justice, the darkest moments in a system built on fear, faith, and control. Most women experienced humiliation, penance, or domestic punishment, but the mere existence of mutilation or execution created a powerful atmosphere of fear. Fear made accusations dangerous even when they didn't escalate. Cliffhanger ending for Chapter 5. But here's the surprising twist. So what actually happened to the majority of women? Why were these extreme punishments so rare, despite their terrifying reputation? Chapter 6 uncovers the hidden truth and reveals what medieval life for accused women really looked like behind the legends. Chapter 6, the final breath of the secret weapon. Dawn crept over the forest canopy like a silent thief, its first rays slicing through the cold mist that hovered above the undergrowth. For a long moment, the world held its breath. No birds sang, no wind whispered. Even the leaves seemed frozen, as if they too sensed that whatever was about to happen here would decide the fate of more than just one hidden village. The wood was still damp from his frantic work. Every spoke, every slot, every notch had been altered, strengthened, and tightened for one purpose: to use the mountain's own fury as a weapon no medieval army had ever imagined. Behind him, the villagers waited in tense silence. Some gripped crude spears, others held buckets, ropes, and tools, but what united them wasn't the weapons. They had always been farmers, woodcutters, and mill workers, not soldiers. What gave them courage was the enormous wooden wheel standing like a sleeping giant at the center of the clearing, their wheel, their lifeline, their last defense. A rumble shook the forest. The villagers jerked their heads toward the sound. The earthy vibration rose through the soil, up their legs, into their chests. "They're here," through the tree line. The first glint of steel appeared, dozens of helmets emerging like a swarm of silver insects. The northern raiders moved with terrifying precision, spreading out in a crescent formation designed to trap anything in its path. Their commander urged them forward, confident, unaware that the villagers had plans buried beneath the very earth they walked on. At once, the villagers moved. The dam above the wheel, a crude wooden gate hammered together, and desperation creaked as two men pulled at the release rope. The tension snapped with a crack, and a roaring torrent of water surged forward. It barreled down the dugout channel with brutal force, frothing, twisting, growing into a white wall of churning power. The raiders looked up too late. The water slammed into the clearing, not toward the village as an uncontrolled flood, but in a carved path designed by the villagers themselves. It struck the wheel with explosive force. The entire structure shuddered. The spokes groaned. Water sprayed outward in blinding sheets. And then, a wheel spun. The first impact sent men crashing backward as if punched by an invisible giant. The spinning arms became a storm of flailing destruction, an improvised machine with enough force to break bone, crush ribs, and splinter shields. The commander shouted orders, but the roar of water drowned everything. A second surge of water hit. The wheel screamed, spinning even faster. Bits of wood tore off. Stones flew like arrows, whipping through the air with lethal precision. The ground soaked into mud, making the raiders slip as they tried to retreat. Some attempted to rush through the chaos, but the spinning arms swatted them aside like rag dolls. The wheel wouldn't hold. There was too much power, too much water, too much strain. The tower's base cracked. The raiders, sensing the danger, hesitated. Some froze, for one horrifying, awe-inspiring moment. It rolled a spinning titan straight toward the remaining raiders. Men scattered, screaming, as the colossal mass crushed trees, splintered shields, and broke their formation completely before smashing into the slope and collapsing into a spray of shattered timber. Silence fell. The raiders, those still standing, turned and fled. And now, the world would remember the day a hidden mountain settlement defeated an army not with swords, not with knights, not with fortresses, but with a will built for water and turned into war.